Do you know who you are? I mean, do you really know who you are? I'm not asking about names. I'm asking, do you know who you are as a human being? Do you know why you are in this world? Do you know your purpose? Do you know your reason for living? Those are important questions. And it's interesting, John is asked those. Who are you? And he could have said, well, I'm Zechariah's son, but that isn't what he said. He said, I am a voice crying out in the desert, make straight the way of the Lord. I'm here to get ready. I'm here to get you ready. No, he understood himself quite well. And he had no illusions about who he was. He had every right to those, possibly. If you look in Luke's gospel at the story of John's birth, it was rather miraculous. Zechariah, his father, was a priest and was serving in the temple. He was offering incense when the angel Gabriel appeared to him. And the archangel told him, just as the archangel would appear to Mary months later and say, you're going to have a child. And it's by the Lord that this is going to happen. And Zechariah says, really? Really? Look how old I am. How can that be? And my wife, she's old too. I mean, that ain't going to happen, my friend. And Gabriel said to Zechariah, well, it's going to happen. And you will name him John. But because you would not believe, you will no longer be able to speak. And it was like that for many months until John was born. And on the 8th day, when it came for him to be circumcised, and in the Jewish tradition, a child is only named on the 8th day, they asked, well, what are we going to call him? And, everybody thought it should be Zechariah because that's his dad's name. And that's the way it usually is done. And his mother, Elizabeth, said, no, his name is John. And that's significant because when he said his name was John, he was saying that this one is God's gift. That's what the name John means in Hebrew, God's gift. This is God's gift to us. And they said, well, that doesn't make any sense. And they turned to Zechariah and they said, well, what do you want him to be called? Can you tell us? Can you show us? And he asked for a tablet. He signaled for that. And he wrote in Hebrew, his name is John. This is God's gift. And with that, he was able to speak again. And I'm sure he told the story of the encounter with the archangel Gabriel. I'm sure he told it many times. I'm sure that John grew up hearing that story over and over again, not just from his parents, but from the other people in the area, because the word spread. This was something that was unheard of. And John could have had a big head, but he didn't. Somehow, in his time in the desert, he came to understand who he was. He was a real misfit. It's not tightly wrapped by any stretch of the imagination for all intents and purposes when you looked at him. I mean, here's a guy who eats bugs and honey and wears funny clothes and has wild hair and, is rather strident in everything that he says. And it's just kind of like, really? It's kind of some of those people that you just kind of steer clear of. And they came out to him in droves because he was baptizing at the southern end of Judea, right where the Jordan River, just before it empties into the Dead Sea. And it's shallow there, and it usually runs a little more slowly at that point. It's an ideal place for caravans to go back and forth across the Jordan because there was no bridge. They had to find a place where they could cross or go all the way around the Sea of Galilee to get to the other side. And so it was an ideal place. It was kind of the highway. And it was there that John was baptizing, and the word spread about this guy, and they were coming from all over. And when people gain notoriety like that, the authorities begin to take notice and express real concern. And so they come, and they want to know, who are you? Who are you? And John simply says, I'm a voice in the desert. I'm trying to get ready for him. He's coming. He's already here. You don't see him yet, but he's already here among you. You know, they said, well, okay, if you're not that one, then are you Elijah the prophet? Because there was a long tradition that Elijah, who was taken up to heaven in that fiery chariot, would come back again before the Messiah comes. And he says, no, that's not me. Well, are you the apocalyptic prophet who comes to inaugurate the new era, this new time of God's grace and favor that Isaiah spoke of so often? No, that's not me. I'm just here to get ready for him. That's the only reason I'm here, to help others be ready, to wash themselves clean, and to be ready and open to receive the gift of the one we've been longing for. He's here. He's among us right now, and we need to get ready to really open our minds and hearts to him. John had no illusions about who he was. He was very clear. He knew who he was and why he was here. And it brings me back to the initial question. Do we know who we are and why we are here? In preparing for the homily, I ran across a story that I loved. It comes from Papua New Guinea. It's a story of an older gentleman whose name was One Tooth. Nobody seemed to know his real name because that's what everybody called him. Because, you see, when he smiled, you would see that he only had one tooth in the front. You know, and everybody just called him One Tooth. And that's the way he was known. He supported himself by cutting firewood and selling it. But whenever he had any free time, he would go to the clinic at the mission nearby. And he would sit with the people as they were waiting to see the doctor, and he would read to them the gospel and tell them the stories of Jesus. And that gave him a real purpose and meaning in life, just to be with those people at that time and tell them the story of Jesus, to read that from the gospel. Well, one day, old One Tooth realized that he couldn't see as well as he used to, and it was getting worse. And so he made some time with the doctor, and the doctor examined him and said to him, One Tooth, I'm sorry, but you're going blind, and there's nothing I can do to stop that. I'm very, very sorry. Old One Tooth never said anything after that. He just left. And he never showed up the next day at the mission clinic. He didn't for several days. And people began to ask what happened to him, and the doctor began to be very concerned because he didn't know how despondent old One Tooth would be. So he started asking questions and found out from a young boy that old One Tooth was over in a deserted area, not that far away, but still an area that's out of the way. And the doctor went to see him. And when he walked up, he saw that One Tooth looked healthy. I mean, it didn't look like he was languishing in despair. And he said to him, One Tooth, where have you been? How have you been getting by? He said, well, that boy that told you I was here, he's been bringing me food. And in the meantime, I've been memorizing the gospel. And I read it, I tell that back to him, and he has the book, and he tells me whether or not I've made a mistake so I can get it right. But I've been memorizing the gospel so that when I go blind, I can still tell people the good news of Jesus. I love that story. Because old One Tooth, even though we never knew his name, knew who he was and what he was about, why he was here. And that brings us back to that question, who are we and why are we here? I'm going to say the first and most important thing that we need to understand is that you and I are also named John. We are God's gift. We are all a gift. No one ever said I had a right to be alive, I had a right to live at this time, or I had to have another day of life. No one ever said that. It's not written anywhere. It is because God decided that God so loved the world that he gave each one of us, not just his only Son, but each one of us to the world. Each one of us is a gift from God. That's important. Who are we? We are God's gift to the world. Not in any illusionary way, but we are all here by God's design. And our sole and most important purpose is to be loved by God. If God is love, then God needs to give that love away. And that's why we were created, to be the object of God's love. That is our sole purpose in life, is to be loved by God. And when we truly understand that God has given us the gift of life, that God has loved us from the very beginning when we were still a thought in the mind of God, that God still loves us, that God loves us deeply and passionately, and we are worth the price of his only begotten Son, just so that we would be God's own. When we understand that, then we understand why we are in this world. And when we accept that love and we begin to live it, we become a sign of God's compassion and mercy and kindness and goodness to everyone we meet. And we recognize that they too are a gift from God. And we are grateful that they are in our life, because no one ever said we had a right to have them. We are God's gift to one another and to the world. And our purpose is to be loved by God. And when we live that love, we become something really important in this world. We become a sign of that love to others, because there are so many in the world that do not believe in God's love, who don't even know God's love, who really don't even know the story of Jesus and how he came to bring that love to birth in this world. They don't know that. They haven't read the gospel. They don't know the good news of God's love revealed to us in Christ. And the only way they may ever discover that is from you and me. That the only way they may ever know the gospel is because they've seen it in us. They've experienced in our love, in our care, our compassion, our living the love that God has for us. It has been said, my sisters and brothers, and I love the saying, that you and I may be the only gospel that others may ever read. And while that puts a lot of pressure on us, we don't need to worry about what to say or how to do it. I love the line of St. Francis of Assisi, who said, "Preach always, and when necessary, use words." And that's what we are called to do, to be that good news to one another, so that others may come to know that they are loved, that they are a gift, that they know who they are and why they are. They may only know that if they experience that from us. Because in truth, my sisters and brothers, you and I may be the only gospel that they will ever read.